Greetings. Today we're delighted to host two leaders from International Justice Mission, or IJM, to talk about their work at IJM and their approach to stewardship. One of the things that we see over and over again as we read the Bible is not just that we are stewards because God owns it all, our finances, our talents, our time, our relationships, and even our experiences, but that God expects us to use what He has given us in service of our neighbors, and in particular, in helping our poor neighbors. One of the ways that we do that as a firm is providing financial and prayer support for IJM, specifically for their work in freeing slaves in India, because we are partners of that particular field office. We're consistently connected to what's happening at their office in India and can pray for their work more specifically in freeing slaves and helping to equip the Indian government and police in a variety of different ways to help protect the poor. Now, they do this all over the globe with 31 different field offices and 1,400 staff. But we love that we are also connected intimately to that one particular field office so that we can pray and understand what they're up to more specifically.
Big picture, IJM is a global ministry who works to protect the poor from violence and has done so for the last 26 years. They aim to strengthen local justice systems by partnering with government officials and law enforcement to rescue victims, restore survivors, and bring criminals to justice. And they have been a part of bringing relief to over 85,000 men, women, and children. The need is tremendous. It's estimated that there are around 50 million people currently in slavery, 28 million of them in forced labor, and 22 million in forced marriages. The Scale of Harm Project reported that 1.7 million children are exploited in sex trafficking each year. The immensity of the problem is sobering, but there is hope. Since the beginning of IJM's work in the Dominican Republic, they've been able to see a 78% reduction of sex trafficking and seen similar results in other countries. In the next 7 years, IJM has a vision to rescue millions, protect 500 million, and prove justice for the poor is unstoppable. IJM was founded by Gary Hogan, who worked at the Department of Justice's Police Brutality Unit and was put on loan to the UN to investigate the genocide of Rwanda.
Austin and I have actually read Hogan's book, The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. And I'm not so sure that I've ever read anything more moving in the stories that Hogan unpacks. I was crying so many different times and had just a great sense of godly anger that so many poor are in this plight today. But the book's also full of hope because we serve a loving God who has a heart for the poor and is giving life and energy to IJM and their partners that can bring about lasting change. Welcome to the Second Half Stewardship Podcast. We believe that God owns it all, and our response as Christians is to live generous lives. I'm Spencer Hall, a certified financial planner.
And I am Austin McLaughlin. As former full-time missionaries in the United States and overseas, Spencer and I approach managing our personal finances through the lens of biblical stewardship.
Journey with us as we explore how to be generous stewards of our money, time, relationships, gifts, and experiences. Today we have Jocelyn White and Chuck Day, who both serve in North America with IJM, to tell us more about IJM's work. And we're really excited again to have you all. Jocelyn is IJM's Director of Strategic Partnerships, and Chuck is the Director of Planned Giving. So Chuck and Jocelyn, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, we're thrilled to be here.
First, we have a sense of the importance of the topic, of course, that we're talking about today. But I'll say that it's also personally important for me because when I told my kids who are age 9 through 15, there's 4 of them, that I'd be hosting an IJM podcast and you talking about IJM, they told me in all seriousness that I better not foul this up because IJM's work is too important. And so knowing that we'd be taping today, my 15-year-old, our oldest, he told me last week, he said, "Dad, you have got to get a haircut for this video session." So with that, as funny as sometimes the interactions are with kids, I'm so pleased that they are cognizant of how important your work is and how much they want IJM to succeed, to thrive, to be able to defend the poor, to be able to stand up and have a voice for the poor. And we are just again, so thrilled to have you today and to be able to hear more and to be able to share that with clients and friends and others in the podcast universe there. So as we kind of dive into today, we thought it might be helpful to kind of start off with IJM's founding and story and background. And so, Gary Hogan's background, his investigation of genocide in Rwanda, because I know that experience was key to starting IJM for Gary. So Jocelyn, I thought maybe you could start by unpacking that experience and how it led to IJM being formed.
Right. That's exactly right, Spencer. So Gary, he was working for the Department of Justice for the Police Brutality Unit, and he was put on loan to the UN to investigate the genocide in Rwanda. And part of his job was to explore where there were mass graves, and most of those places were actually churches. And so he was going through the remains inside churches and logging how each person was murdered. He was interviewing men, women, and children who survived the genocide. And it was a very traumatic experience for him, as you can imagine. And one day he was sitting in a church, just kind of overwhelmed by it all, and cried out to God and just said, God, where were you during all of this? And he just felt God impress on his heart and said, I was here, but where were you? And so he really reflected on that. And when he returned to the States, he started exploring ways that he could utilize his skills as a lawyer to do things like protect the poor from violence. And what he found was that the majority of Christian investment and giving was given towards church planting and discipleship, and very little to areas of injustice. So he kind of penned the idea of IJM on a napkin and waited till he received a grant and 100 prayer partners, and then IJM was birthed out of his basement.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a powerful story. Thanks for sharing, Jocelyn. So you guys are both on staff with IJM. How did you find IJM? What was your journey like to get to where you're at?
Yeah, so I was on the executive team at a church, and we used to always go to the Willow Creek Leadership Summit every year. And back in 2008, there was this guest speaker, Gary Hogan, and I was ready to take all these notes on leadership, but I didn't take one single note because he brought up two things I had not heard before. And one was the issue of human trafficking, and that it was the second largest crime in the world. And then number two, that God cared about justice, and he called his church to seek justice, to rescue the oppressed, to defend the poor, and plead for the widow. And I was on staff, I think at that time, for about 7 years. I probably had perfect church attendance and led a life group. And I just felt a conviction of the deep imbalance I had, focusing on the production of church service as opposed to the protection of the poor from violence. So I felt really compelled by that and just started to ask God, what can I do?
Thanks for sharing, Jocelyn. What about you, Chuck? What led you to IJM?
Yeah, I like to tell people that I'm a recovering lawyer, because I am. And I was on the pathway of a very traditional lawyer in private practice when God intervened pretty radically in two different ways. Number one, he took me out of private practice and into the Christian nonprofit world, which, quite frankly, I didn't even know existed, to do a thing called plan giving, in which I help people be wise stewards of their giving. And I did that in higher education for a number of years. And then God showed up again and decided that I needed to be immersed in the world of extreme developing world poverty. And I connected with an organization that was going into the poorest areas of the world and providing small loans, mostly to women, to help them build up businesses and work their way out of poverty. And that experience changed my life. My heart was broken 1,000 times by the poverty that I saw. And I saw over and over again that if you really, really want to help poor people, the first thing you need to do is keep them safe. because we provide education and healthcare and mosquito netting and clean water and all these things that we're trying to help poor people get out of poverty. And they all work as long as people are safe. But if people aren't safe, none of them work. So ultimately, that's what brought me to IJM, sort of as the ultimate expression of trying to help poor people in the developing world get out of poverty.
Yeah. I think that was one of the things that struck me reading The Locust Effect last year, was just how much time and energy I put into thinking about, okay, what are the things that I need to do, or what are the things that we can do to help, whether it's the poor locally or globally. And it always came back to things like you were talking about, Chuck, mosquito nets, wells, things like this, and the stunning effect that has without those justice systems kind of in play as well was just staggering. I was so surprised that can move the needle a little bit, but without the help of actual protection, there's little that does. So as you think about both of your roles in a church setting for you, Jocelyn, as a lawyer, Chuck, what continues to compel you to work for IJM? Chuck, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah. Spencer, if back in 2015, if you had told me that 100,000 people in this world were enslaved, I wouldn't have believed you. Because the last word I had about slavery was probably in college, where they told me that slavery ended at the end of the Civil War. And I had no concept that slavery still existed in the world. And if you had told me that 50 million people were enslaved in this world, I'm not sure I would have been able to wrap my brain around that fact. What keeps me at IJM is that we're winning. IJM has actually developed a methodology that defeats the prevalence of crime against the poor in something that has never been done in the history of mankind. Never has mankind been able to protect the poor, maybe even wanted to protect the poor from violence. And IJM has created a methodology that does it just amazingly well, no matter what culture or country we work in. And what keeps me coming to work every day is I feel like God has given me a front row seat to a miracle that he's doing in the world. He is protecting the poor from violence in a way that's never been done before. And if everything works out the way that IJM has it planned, we're going to protect 500 million people by 2030. So why would you want to give up a front row seat for something like that?
Oh, that's so good, Chuck. And then I get to sit next to people like Chuck every day. Is one of the things that compels me. I mean, honestly, if I can think back when I first heard of IJM, the things that compelled me about IJM was their commitment to prayer and partnering with local justice systems and government officials and law enforcement, and their commitment to 90% of the staff being nationals from where they work. But I would say now it's our mission and it's the people at IJM. It is an honor to get a chance to work with such committed, faithful, and generous people, just like Chuck, and wicked smart people, just like Chuck, that I get to learn and work alongside. So it's just a really fun organization to be a part of. And we're all fully dependent on God, because if you just wrote down what we had to do each day and our mission and our goals and took God out of the equation, I mean, we would totally be lost. And so it is, like Chuck said, just getting a front row seat at seeing God do his miracles through his people, his imperfect people.
Yep.
Well, and I love that you talk about the people that you get to work with and the partnership. One of the things that's so beautiful in seeing is just even the way that you frame that mission and that engagement as coming alongside, and being really a supportive influence, a cheerleader, one that can provide resources and best practices and all these different things, because we know, if history is any guide, that if we come in and we try to do the work, then it's not going to produce lasting change. But that model, I think, is so winsome because you're coming alongside and, you're patiently supporting and encouraging and loving, just as Christ did as he came into the world and was among us there with patience and love in so many different ways. So, and just being connected to the India office, I mean, just one location of more than 30 that you have, you just get a flavor of the people that you have working with you. So it's been a gift for us to even see a small part of that.
And, one thing, Spencer, to kind of piggyback off that, and one thing that you mentioned, Jocelyn, was that you try to raise up nationals. And I think when I worked in a nonprofit Christian organization that worked with international students in the US, it was, okay, how do we continue to allow them and empower them to be leaders back in their home countries? Because it was always, what are we doing to send them back? Because if we are constantly going as Americans to other places, but not replicating locals to do it, within a couple of generations, the work starts to dissipate. So it's really a beautiful thing. As you guys are in these places, you're raising up nationals to do that. So would love to hear, coming from a law background, a church background, how do you guys feel like your prior jobs really prepared you to work at IJM? And, even as I think about this, there's only so much that you can do that's not within the work of the poor to prepare you for the trauma that you experience in working with a place like IJM, because it's hard, it's challenging, but would love to hear, like, how did God prepare you as you were working in jobs before IJM?
Well, Austin, I kind of have to chuckle because if you heard how I got to IJM, I mean, it's kind of comical. So before I came to IJM, I had a short stint working in a church, but I had about a 12, 13 and a half year career in entertainment. I was a choreographer, a performer, a director, and a producer. And so sitting in front of a computer, preparing for a podcast like this, telling people about slavery and inviting them to invest in the work was never on my radar back then. The only way I can kind of see how God kind of used that to prepare me for what I'm doing now is I kind of have this ability in my brain to kind of have a bird's eye view of a bunch of things that are going on at the same time and understanding different roles. And at times I help with events and being on stage or in front of a camera is something that I'm used to. So I can see that that's helpful, but I think so much of the development and the transformation and the skills that I've uncovered at IJM was actually starting to work at IJM. And we have a VP of spiritual formation named Jim Martin. He was our first boss. And he would always say, God calls us to this mission. He's with us in this mission, and he transforms us through the mission. And I think that's what I experience every day.
That's great.
Yeah. I think when you get to my stage of career, one of the first things you recognize is that God doesn't waste anything. When I was in private practice, I was a general practitioner. So I did real estate and estate planning and tax planning and all these different things that at the time I never dreamed I would actually be applying to help generous people be wise givers and to impact the world through organizations like IJM. So in the work that I do now, in helping people be wise stewards, every bit of my law background comes into play every week of my job. And sometimes I will look back and just marvel at some random experience that I had in private practice that gave me the experience to go ahead and help somebody do something now, decades later, that you could not have connected at the time. So I look back and smile at that because I see that, God was planning this path the whole way.
And if I could add to that, what Chuck mentioned having a front row seat at miracles. I've had partners that I've introduced to Chuck who are trying to figure out how they can maximize their giving while minimizing their taxes. And Chuck will just share information and you just see the light bulbs go off. I could do that. Oh my goodness, this could increase my giving exponentially. And it is just so fun to watch. And so to me, that's super fun and joyous to be able to introduce someone to Chuck and him share all of his wealth and the knowledge that he has gained over his career and see God unlock resources through that. I think that's really fun to be part of.
Yeah,
IJM places a really high priority on stewardship. We have a responsibility to steward the funds that our donors give us. We are trying to protect incredibly poor, vulnerable people who don't have resources of their own, so we're having to bring them in. And that is a huge responsibility, and the whole organization feels that. So I'm certainly not the only one who engages in wise stewardship. It's simply, this is the avenue that God has given me to do it.
I think this may be an interesting question here. And if Chuck or Jocelyn, if this is something that's kind of outside of the purview of what you see, we can pass on this. But I'll just frame it, and, it's recording regardless, and we can splice and cut and do different things. Chuck, you were talking about stewardship and IJM really trying to be great stewards of both the people and the finances and all that God has given. And obviously the task that you have, the mission that you have is so big.
Yep.
How have you seen your leadership team kind of grapple with, when they have funds to maybe move into a new arena, or when they have an opportunity? How do you kind of digest? Is this something that we're going to go for, or is there a different path? Because obviously we've got 180 or 190 countries in the world, and every one of them has some level of injustice, and some have a tremendous amount of poverty, and could have IJM locate there. What does it look like for your leadership team to kind of grapple with, the next steps that you take on that path to a vision of defending the poor?
I think maybe the first and perhaps easiest answer is prayer. Gary started this whole organization with the understanding that if prayer was not the backbone of the organization, this wasn't going to last. I think part of the beauty of coming to the whole arena of human trafficking from a Christian perspective is that you understand and appreciate the evil that is behind the trafficking. And if you try to attack that and battle that with human power alone, you're going to fail miserably. And Gary totally understood that and appreciated that when he created the organization and built the entire organization on the basis of prayer. Jocelyn and I have the privilege of getting paid to pray 1 hour every workday.
Wow.
I don't know any other organization on the planet that does that other than us. So when our leadership team has an opportunity or a challenge, and we have a choice as to how to allocate precious donor dollars to a situation, the first thing our leadership team does is places at God's feet and says, what do you want us to do? Maybe that's the essence of real stewardship, because it is God's money, and he's got a definite idea of what he wants us to do with it. And our job is to simply ask. One of the beauties of working in the developing world is that a dollar goes a long way. And our donors love the fact that when they give to us, they know that we're leveraging those dollars in economies where a dollar goes a long way. So in addition to the actual impact of our work in rescuing, girls from brothels and families from brick factories, we're actually doing it at a highly efficient cost because we're able to do this in the developing world where the dollar simply goes a lot farther.
Yeah. That's so powerful that the need is so significant and the weight is so significant, but we have a God, that is right there with us and leading. Think to Ephesians 2:4. We have all of these things that we're fallen and such, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loves us. And I love that focus that you have, that priority of prayer, because, you just even read the first story from the locust effect. And, if you have any kids, you have a daughter, I have two daughters that are just slightly older than the little girl that whose story is in that first chapter. And it's just gut wrenching. So, being able to lay that at the Lord's feet, I could imagine only would be so critical, not to be overwhelmed even by the evil, that you confront organizationally every day. But that's such a moving answer and such a call, I think, for all of us to be people of prayer as we think about our stewardship role there. In our introduction, and in our conversation, you've mentioned that IJM has this audacious vision of rescuing millions and protecting 500 million and proving that justice for the poor is unstoppable. And yet we know that there's all these kinds of challenges along the way. As you think about those challenges that you see day to day, or that you see that are some of the biggest ones that you confront, what comes to mind? Jocelyn, first for you, what strikes you each day?
Sure. So two things come immediately to mind. And first is relationships, and the second is resources. Part of our core values at IJM is to really be bridge builders, right? We really want to collaborate because we can do so much more together than alone. And so we are really committed to developing personal relationships with government officials and law enforcement, social services, churches, advocates on the field. And sometimes a kind of a tension to manage is if, let's say, we're working with a certain official for, we've developed a relationship for a number of years, all of a sudden gets transferred out or retires or someone new gets voted in, then it's almost like, oh, we have to start that relationship all over again and just hope and pray this person is going to be just as invested in protecting their community as the last person was. So that we're always juggling that at IJM. And then I would say resources, like you said, we have this audacious goal of protecting 500 million people by 2030, right? And so the great thing is we have a pathway to get there, and we know that it's possible. And so we just have to be expectant and believe and invite people to be a part of this, and we just know that there are enough resources in the world to make this possible. And it's just about finding out, who feels called at this time to be part of this work and bringing resources towards the work.
Yeah, I guess I think back to when Gary was starting IJM, and he was floating the idea of starting an organization that would protect poor people in the developing world from violent crime. And everyone in government and outside of government told Gary it was impossible, that he would never be able to rescue a single person. And I think we're about 85,000 or 86,000 right now. And the reason they told him that is because the challenges at times can seem overwhelming. We're trying to do something that's never been done before. There's no blueprint for this. We're trying to do it in areas of extreme poverty, where there is simply no law enforcement at all for the poor. We're trying to work with governments and legal systems that are tremendously under-resourced and under-trained. We're trying to do this work in cultures in which the poor have been ignored forever. So the challenges are immense. And then here in the United States and in the Western world, where we're raising the funds, we have to educate people that for 5 billion people on this planet, there is no law enforcement. That when they're the victim of a crime, there is no 911. There is no police officer that's going to come and help them. We take that for granted here. So we're trying to get people here in the United States and the Western world to understand the enormity of the issue and how important it is for us to care about our brothers and sisters who live elsewhere on the planet, and what it's going to take from a resource standpoint to get that work done.
I think one of the things that was so interesting in reading The Locust Effect, Chuck, and you mentioned, not having a culture of caring for the poor and the things that we take for granted in the West. One of the things that was so surprising to me is how little I knew of our history of our justice systems and how, they had to evolve in the West over the last couple hundred years as well. And you've done such a nice job in recognizing, okay, there's steps along this way. They didn't just magically appear, several thousand years ago for us. It wasn't like, Moses came down with the 10 Commandments and we've been, living in some kind of place where we have police, presence ever since. It's really been in the last couple hundred years that we've even seen that in the West, but there were steps that were taken, and you're trying to learn from those and then mimic those in many ways of building relationship, trust, best practice, all of these kind of elements there. As you think about those areas where, you look and you say, this might be a great area for us to be able to enter and have some impact. What are some of the things that you see kind of as commonalities of areas that as you've gone in, you've been able to see the work and see it accelerate maybe a little bit more quickly than in some other areas where it's a harder field? Or there are certain things with countries or municipalities or localities that have kind of helped you along in that path or that you've been able to learn from there?
Yeah.
I think it comes down to people, right? And we just trust God to steer people's hearts because it does seem impossible, but we are just committed to waiting and asking God, who should we partner with? Who can we come alongside of on the field? And for Chuck and I, that we could give you names of investigators and lawyers and social workers that we have come to know and love over the years. And if any friend or family member of mine, God forbid, ever ended in a situation of exploitation, it would be our colleagues at IJM that I would have the utmost trust to walk us through. And so I just think that we are just following God's calling to be a part of it and acting in faith. And oftentimes Gary will remind us that, what? Ultimately, I want you to remember that God loves us and he loves what we're trying to do. And the work is going to be really hard and it's going to be really challenging a lot of the time. And there are a lot of times that we have tried things and fallen short or have failed at something. But we also say, we never give up and we never go away, right? So sure. I remember, it was in Ghana. We had just finished our first rescue operation. And it was a huge celebration for the entire organization. And shortly thereafter, the government shut down operations and they shut us down for 2 years. And so everyone was like, why don't you just give up and leave, right? Everyone that would make sense of it all. But we just felt that God really wanted us to be there. And we prayed, and our staff on the field just did what they could, which was develop relationships with aftercare shelters, with churches. So when the time was right, they were all ready. And what happened was, after that 2 years, the leaders who are stopping IJM from doing the work that we were wanting to do were all removed from office and replaced. This is like a handful of leaders were all replaced with people that were committed to ending child slavery on Lake Volta. And to this day, they are working really hard to do that work. But that taught us so much as an organization about being faithful and being committed and allowing God to lead us and to open doors and just be faithful in what he's called us to do.
Yeah. Spencer, at maybe a 30,000 foot level, one of the things that we do see that can accelerate the process of reducing the prevalence of crime is when a national government decides that this is a priority for their country. You guys are partnering with our work in India. Half of the world's slaves live in India, which I'm sure is part of what attracted you to the impact of your involvement there. But years ago, the Indian government wouldn't even acknowledge that slavery existed in their country. And then just a few short years ago, they stood in front of the world and said, we've got a problem here. We're going to eliminate it. And IJM is our partner to do it.
Wow.
So when a national government steps up and says that this is a national priority, that sends a message all the way down the line to the beat cop on the street that says that this is now important and that this is a priority and that this is a situation that is no longer going to be allowed to exist.
Wow. And that's so powerful in India, from a personal perspective. My wife and I have a niece who was adopted from India a few years ago. And of course, our son, we adopted a number of years ago from China. But what we know is that many of those orphans around the world are among those that are most likely to be exploited. And so for my wife and I, as missionaries in China for a few years, could see that some of the just the exploitation, the human trafficking that was going on, because you would be confronted with beggars and children, and oftentimes who had been beaten or abused, and we didn't really understand the story very well until we had folks that were working in against human trafficking that could unpack some of what would often go around in these situations. And so that's one of the things, your heart you see these kids that are being taken advantage of, and there's not a government that's willing to, do things. And it's so wonderful that India, at least at that time, it didn't seem like the government where we were was willing to, do things to kind of rectify situation. But with India, at this point, it's wonderful that there's a tremendous amount of impact that can be had with a partnering, situation, and just all that you're doing there. So grateful for the Lord's work through you and your team over there. And that is one of the reasons that we're so excited to be able to partner.
If you found this episode valuable, share it with a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss the next episode.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.